Let me begin by just giving you a brief background about history, what we're trying to do here tonight. The Broad Street West redevelopment project has been in the planning stages, as you know, in the city for probably a year and a half, and we are at the critical stage of putting together not only the real estate and planning components of the project, but also the financial components, because it's not just a real estate project, it's also a financial transaction between Summit and the real estate developer. It is, in my considerable experience in doing redevelopment projects in New Jersey, one of the most extraordinary public-private partnerships that I have had the opportunity to work on, and we'll talk about what that means in the course of this presentation. Let me give you a brief background, first of all, about who I am and why I'm here tonight talking to you as something of an expert. I have advanced graduate training from Princeton University in economics and public policy. Early on in my career, I was the executive director of the New Jersey Economic Development Authority in Trenton, which is the state's investment bank for real estate development. Subsequent to that, I had a 25-year active career as a developer of real estate throughout New Jersey as a principal. And I still do occasional development as a principal, but our company now serves as financial advisor to public and private agencies in the focus on real estate finance and development throughout New Jersey. We have represented probably hundreds of clients, both public and private, in doing complicated projects similar to what we're going to be talking about tonight. We have put together, for your visual assistance, a slideshow that will walk us through what we think are the key elements of this project. And I will, as we go through them, just highlight some of the key things that I think they represent. So let me start with a brief description of the project. What is being proposed here on the city property downtown is a development that will consist of 140 rental apartments. Those apartments will be a mixture of sizes: studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, and 3 bedrooms. It will also be a mixture of incomes and tenant eligibility. So 112 of the 140 units will be what are called market rate apartments. The developer will be charging the market rates of rent, and we'll be talking a little bit about that in a moment. 7 of the units will be something rather unusual in New Jersey redevelopment right now, which are called workforce housing. They are not technically, under COA standards, affordable housing, but they are certainly not market rate. And the idea here is to create a group of apartments in this project that will hit what we call workforce families who aren't poor and they aren't wealthy. They're somewhere in the middle. And the definition of somewhere in the middle would be families that are making no more than 120% of the median income in Union County. Then the balance of the apartments, or 21 of them, will be what we call affordable. And they are affordable under the definition of the Mount Laurel and COA standards, low and moderate income persons. And we're going to be talking a little bit about what that means statistically in just a moment.
Excuse me, Dr. Powell, would you mind staying a little closer to the
Sure.
mic so
Thank
that
you.
folks at home can hear you? Sorry.
I appreciate you telling me that. The affordable units, by the way, as you see here, are an important component for the city to utilize in satisfying its third-round obligations under the Mount Laurel dictum. The other piece of the project is it will include 10,000 square feet of retail space at the ground level. Let me just briefly give you a visual overview of the project before we start crunching numbers. This is the concept plan. You can see Broad Street at the top. The project is basically running along the intersection of Cedar at Broad Street. Here's another elevation of the building. It's one building, 5 stories, as you see here, with a lot of landscaping and plaza treatment around the edges. This is the view or perspective from Broad and Cedar, and another view from Broad Street. I'm not sure I mentioned, but the developer of this project is a joint venture that consists of Toll Brothers Rental Apartment Housing Group and a group called L&M Partners, both of which I've had extensive experience working with. They're extraordinarily capable, well-financed, and competent developers, and I think you're fortunate to have a team like that that's doing this project. Here's another elevation. A quick set of comments about the affordable housing units that are in the building. Many of you in the front of the room here, I'm sure, have become experts in affordable housing by necessity, but folks here in the audience and at home may not fully understand what it means to have affordable housing units in a project like this. The way the process works is that the 21 units that will be considered affordable will be restricted to families that have less than a certain income, as defined by where they are in the income stack between 35% of median and 60% of median. You see here the incomes that a family of 1, 2, 3, or 4 persons can earn to fit into one of those categories. So, for example, a family of 3 that's 35% of median or lower, which is considered very low income, can't have an income of more than $33,000. The other income, so this gives you a sense of the family incomes of the families and tenants that will occupy the affordable units. Briefly, the way those tenants are selected is that they're not picked by the developer. These units will be subject to administration by the city's administrative agent. There's an agency that handles your affordable housing matters. The units will be advertised, one built, for applicants who think they would like to live in one of the units. They will submit applications. The applications will include a requirement for income statements, tax returns, other forms of financial evidence that they are capable of paying the rent. And as is often the case, there will be more applications than there are units. So that will often lead to a lottery that, again, is not run by the developer. That's run by your administrative agent. And there are a whole bunch of other rules and regulations that are designed to make this a fair process for the affordable families. And the result will be that the building will have a rich mix of incomes in it. The rents that you see here for the affordable units are going to range from $800 a month to probably $1,500 a month. A 2-bedroom market rate apartment in this project, we project, will probably rent for $3,800 a month. So you're going to have quite a spread, which is the whole point. A mixed income project that will serve not just the higher income tenants in the area, but will also provide a diversity of opportunity, as Mount Laurel has intended. With that brief background about what the project looks like and how the affordable process works, let's turn briefly to the financial structure of the agreement between the developer and the town and the city that's being negotiated. And the first thing I want to briefly review with you is what a pilot agreement is. That's a term that I assume folks have heard a little bit about in connection with this project. So let me go through a couple of basics. The legislature has passed a law 30 years ago now, the long-term tax exemption law, which permits towns at its discretion to provide tax abatement for certain kinds of redevelopment projects. It does not give a developer the right to a pilot. There is no right to a pilot in New Jersey. It's entirely within the discretion of a municipality as to whether it provides a pilot, but it has that right under this statute. Pilot agreements essentially are designed to facilitate public-private partnerships that have higher costs for the developer than many projects would have if they weren't public-private partnerships. And we're going to go into some of those higher costs in this case in a few minutes. But they include obviously the affordable housing and a few other design features that have been negotiated into this project that the developer probably wouldn't be doing but for the pilot. The pilot is a financial incentive that has attracted private investment to hundreds and hundreds of projects throughout towns in New Jersey, just like Summit. The way the pilot works is as follows. There's a financial agreement between the town and the developer. That's called a financial agreement. And once the financial agreement becomes effective and the project is built and goes into operation, the project and the site of the project come off the tax rolls. It is treated as tax-exempt property, technically, as if it had been acquired by a school or a church. In lieu of paying real estate taxes under the financial agreement, the developer will make payments in lieu of taxes, which is the acronym PILOT, for up to 30 years. And the payment schedule is a percentage of what are called annual gross revenues of the project. It's actually a simple standard compared to most state statutes because annual gross revenues in this case for an apartment building means the top line, the gross revenues. No deductions for operating costs, no deductions for salaries, insurance, repairs and maintenance. It's your gross rents, your parking fees, any other fees you get, that's the annual gross revenues. So it's easy to audit. It's hard to cheat. And by the way, a financial agreement will require annually an audit that the city will get independently that will confirm that the annual gross revenues on which the pilot payments the prior year were calculated are correct. Pilot payments are made quarterly, just like taxes are. And if a developer doesn't make pilot payments per the agreement, the result is the same as not paying your taxes. The city has the ability to put a lien on the property, which is the equivalent of a tax lien. So I'm not aware, frankly, of very many pilot projects that have had defaults because the results for the developer are very unpleasant. The payments that are received under a pilot agreement are distributed differently than real estate taxes. In Summit, you collect taxes, the city gets about 19 or 20%, the Board of Ed gets a chunk, the county gets a chunk. Under the pilot statute that we referenced earlier, the split is a little simpler. It's 95% of the revenues go to the municipality and 5% go to the county. And we'll get into what those numbers mean for this project in just a minute. Now, as if we don't have enough acronyms here, there's another feature to this project that makes it even more interesting and creative and actually has created even more value for the city as a consequence. And that is the proposed agreement will not only include a pilot arrangement, but something called a redevelopment area bond. That's also enabled by the same statute that I referenced earlier, the state statute. The justification for a redevelopment area bond, well, let me say what a bond is. The redevelopment area bond is a bond issue that a municipality will issue. In the case of Summit, it would issue a bond. Someone will buy the bond. The proceeds of the bond will be used to pay for a portion of the cost of this redevelopment project. Unlike most bonds that towns issue, however, a redevelopment area bond is not a general obligation of the city. It's a revenue bond, which means the only security behind that bond is going to be a portion of the pilot revenue that the developer is paying. We will show you the numbers, and I'll show you the numbers in just a minute, but generally speaking, the pilot in this case is going to be generating an average of about $600,000 a year to the city. The RAB bond that we're going to talk about in a minute will require about $100,000 of that $600,000 a pilot. And as a result of that, there will be another $1.7 million of capital available to pay for certain costs in this project that serve a public purpose, but that can't be put inside the four corners of the project financing that the developer's doing. It would make the project not feasible. So essentially, the RAB bond is providing an additional source of capital to pay for a portion of the project. When I say additional, in addition to the developer's equity and the developer's mortgage loan. Those are the only two sources the developer can bring to the table, is equity, and he borrows money from an insurance company or a bank. The additional source of capital that a RAB provides will allow the project to have features that you'll see later, I think, in my opinion, do serve a public purpose, but which couldn't be included in the project but for the RAB bond. That's what a RAB bond is, and we'll get into the details again in just a minute. So let's back up a minute. I said a minute ago that the statute that the state has passed does not make a pilot as of right to a developer. The process everywhere in New Jersey works this way. The developer has to come forward and say, I'm going to do a redevelopment project. Here are my numbers. I can't make them work if I have to pay full taxes. The costs are too high. Maybe your taxes are too high, or some combination of the two. The numbers just don't work. So the developer has to make an application and make a case to the municipality that but for the pilot, the project won't be built, can't be built, and is not financially feasible. That's where I come in, where our company comes in, to look at the numbers that the developers put together, do a very deep financial analysis of the project. And when I say deep, construction costs, hard costs, soft costs, architect, engineering, site work. We look at the proposed rents, and we validate them in terms of our own market research. We look at the proposed financing plan that the developer has put together. They're always going to borrow some money from a bank. Sometimes the developer will say, I'm going to get a long-term mortgage and I'm going to have to pay a 6% interest on it. And we will often say right now, well, you're not a very competitive, you're using not a very competitive mortgage tool because you can borrow right now for around 4%. And the lower the interest rate, the more money you can borrow and the less of a pilot you'll need. We do that kind of analysis as part, for the municipality in this case, to determine independently whether we believe that at full taxes the project can't be successful. That process in this case went forward over a period of, 4 or 5 months with the developer. And we were dealing with pretty sophisticated people on the other side. And I think we came to the right understanding on all the key issues of cost, rents, financing, and arrived at a model that we've put together that we've presented to your team, your staff, that concluded that if the project were built in the absence of a pilot, jumping ahead, without a pilot and at full taxes, our analysis indicated that the developer would need to invest over $23 million of equity in the project. And the return on that equity, and this is going to get a little wonkish, but I'll explain what I'm talking about in just a minute. The return on equity, we measured at about 7.5%. Think about that calculation as a simple investment decision. Suppose each of us had $23 million to invest. Wonderful set of assumptions. And you're in the real estate business, and you have a lot of choices. And especially this particular development team, L&M and Toll, are national developers. Very busy. very active, and have access to billions of dollars worth of capital. The primary basis on which they make a decision as to where to put the next chunk of money is that number, 7.5%. It's too low. The short answer is it's too low to justify the risks involved in the project, and it's also too low because there are redevelopment projects and commercial real estate projects that are going forward right now that generate returns that are at least double that. So that's where you're going to put your money. What we have to decide as your advisor is what is the sweet spot. I've concluded that that's too low, and if the project can't get a pilot, I have said to your colleagues that I'm working with, the project, in my opinion, will not get built. It just won't get built. At least it won't get built with the features that you would like to see in the project, which we'll talk about in a minute, including the affordable housing and the enhancements to the neighborhoods and the parks and that sort of thing. So the next stage of our analysis is to say, well, what will it take to get that internal rate of return up to a level that will attract $20-some million of capital? The reason, by the way, that the returns were too low, among other reasons, were the various non-revenue producing elements of the project that were pulling down the rate of return. We talked earlier about the affordable housing. The affordable housing units, the 21 affordable housing units, don't make any money, but they cost almost as much to build as the market rate units. There are some other things in the project that may not be as obvious to you, but as you get into it, and maybe in further meetings we can explain it in more detail, that pull down the developer's return. There's an existing firehouse on the site. We've said to the developer, we want you to take it down once it's empty. We don't want to demolish it because it's expensive to demolish the building. The site has some environmental issues. They're not horrific, but there's some historic fill there that's going to require some remediation. There's a pesky, large PSE&G underground gas main that runs right through your property. You can't build a 5-story building on top of that. You got to relocate it. PSE&G just won't let you do that. Relocating that is $750,000, just that one thing. And then, if you look at, my pointer here is a little weak, the Cedar Street, Broad Street, and public space features of this project, which may or may not have been provided or discussed earlier. I don't have all the graphics on those, but the project is not just the big building that we saw. It's a series of public spaces and streetscapes that have elevated the feel and quality of Broad Street, Cedar Street, and in the 3 cases of plazas at the bottom, they are gathering places for people in that neighborhood to congregate, and they're expensive. Those public spaces probably together are about $1.3 million of additional cost. They don't generate any revenue to the developer. So what we have put together and recommended for your consideration is a pilot agreement with a RAB that will allow for a lot of different competing priorities to be satisfied. Number one, we want the developer to be incentivized to invest over $20 million in the project and feel like he's going to get a decent return. But we also have the city's priorities that we just summarized there, the affordable housing and the landscaping and the public parks, that we also want to have included in the project. And as we, by the way, a little later, the other thing we'd like to get is a very nice price for your land when they close and buy it. We're going to talk about that in a minute. To achieve all of those financial objectives, I concluded that with a 10% pilot rate, instead of full taxes, 10% of annual gross revenues, and the RAB that we'll talk about, the developer can earn a return of 11.37%. The range of acceptable returns for this type of project, in my professional experience, is between 10 and 15%. So this is in the range of acceptable. It's in the low range. I am confident that there's no excess profit built into this project. This is a tight deal. It's a tight deal. One of the reasons that the developer has agreed to go forward with this level of return, however, and I say this charitably, is that it's Summit. It's not as risky a market as some others whose names I won't mention, where a lot of development's going on right now. The apartments will rent for slightly higher rents. There will be far less vacancy because folks would like to live in Summit. And the opportunities to do that are limited, as you know. The supply of this kind of housing is limited everywhere in New Jersey, including Summit. All of those factors, those market factors, tend to reduce the risk and therefore allow the developer to put money in and accept a slightly lower return. So the project that we were talking about, the financial agreement we're talking about now, would have a 10% pilot rate with a RAB bond. And here is a summary of what the financial results of that transaction would be for the city. In the first year after the project's built, when the pilot first kicks in, Summit's share of the pilot would be $528,000, as you see at the top. Over 30 years, our experience has indicated that that pilot rate is going to go up about 2% a year. Now, why do I say that? The pilot rate goes up for only one reason: rents go up. I think it's conservative, 2% escalation, but we didn't want to get carried away with the forecast. Right now, rents in Class A apartments in New Jersey, as we come out of the pandemic, have been going up 3 to 5%. That's Class A. Who knows? 30 years is a long time. But even at a 2% inflation, your average pilot payment over the 30 years will be $700,000. You're also going to get a $14,000 a year administrative fee, which you get that under the statute because you're administering the pilot. Then we get to the deductions from the pilot payments. So if you go over here to this number, $1,750,000, we have structured this RAB bond to be paid for out of $100,000 a year of pilot revenues. $100,000 a year will pay the debt service on a RAB bond of $1,750,000. The assumption here is a 4% interest rate on that bond and a 30-year amortization. That's subject to change and negotiation as we go forward. I think it's a little conservative, but the interest rate's a little high, but it's a great placeholder because it gives us a sense of what gross revenue comes in under the pilot, what's taken back from the RAB bond, and then what's left over for the city, which is an average annual net pilot revenue of $619,000. So, assuming that we can put this together as I have described it in an overview, what have we done that serves a public purpose in Summit? The first thing we've done will have been to take your current property, which is hugely underutilized as a real estate asset and a rateable, and turned it into a income generating asset that will generate not only pilot revenues, but I'm not sure I mentioned in the agreement we have with the developer, they have agreed to pay the city $8 million for your site, in addition to the pilot revenues. If the project were subject to full taxes, and this is a very hypothetical, but it's important to just see the difference here. If the project were hypothetically could be built under full tax assumptions, the city's 19 or 20% share of the full taxes would generate about $7.3 million in taxes over 30 years. But that is really hypothetical because I've said before, and I'm quite convinced that this is true, the project wouldn't get built if full taxes were levied on it. But just to be clear, that would be your revenue at the city with full taxes. The pilot payments over the 30 years are over $18 million, or twice as much. On a site that's right now, I think, just with the one building on, I think it's generating about $16,000 a year or something.
It's about 30,000 total.
30,000.
6,000 to the municipality.
The municipality, right. In addition, I said the additional benefits will be an $8 million sale proceeds to the city. And in addition to all that, you're going to have the affordable housing and the streetscapes that we talked about earlier, streetscape improvements. One final thing I wanted to just review with you briefly, going back to the $8 million purchase price that we've negotiated, is a question that I think some folks have been asking, which is, what if we didn't go through all of the complexity of this redevelopment process and we just put our property on the market? Just said, put a sign for sale, the developers come in, we're taking bids, here it is, what will you offer us? We ran a rather careful analysis of that question as if we were one of the development firms that were interested in buying your site as is. No redevelopment plan, no pilot, no requirements to do anything other than what your current zoning permits. What your current zoning permits, the underlying zoning. The underlying zoning allows between 40 and 54 apartments to be built on your site, as opposed to the 140 that can be built under the redevelopment plan. The range of densities that you see here depends upon whether the developer goes for some bonus densities, such as surface parking and LEED standards, or none of the above. But in all three of the cases, in my opinion, with the underlying zoning in place, I cannot find a justification for a developer paying $2 million for your property. The highest price I can come up with is the one in the middle, which is the $1.8 million. The alternative, as we just went through a moment ago, is a redevelopment plan, a little more complicated, more density for the developer, but more responsibility for the developer to do some other things that the city would like to have done, and a tax abatement. So there's one final point I want to make before I sit down and take some questions. I know Summit, like all the towns that I'm working with, cares about the impact that development is having on its public schools. We have done, at the request of your team, a deep analysis of the public school impact of this particular project. I'm expecting over the next week or two that the full report that we've done will be available to Michael and would be available on the website to see all the details and assumptions. We do a lot of school impact analyses using the best data that we think is available from the American Community Survey, independent data, and Based on that analysis, our conclusion is that this project is likely to generate 24 public school-age children. Now, the public school-age children, as it may suggest, is designed to rule out private school kids and homeschool kids, just public school-age children. The distribution of those kids is described here. Most of them will be the elementary grades, K through 5, not unusual, because this is not a family-friendly project, frankly, for a family that has a couple of high school kids in the apartment. So most of the kids will be headed to the elementary level, but a few will be in middle and upper school. What does that mean? 24 kids, you may think is a lot, you may think is not a lot. The real answer to the question of what it means is what is the capacity of the school system and what has been the recent trend in enrollment in the Summit Public Schools. We've looked at that pretty carefully. Over the last 10 years, the enrollment in your public schools has been flat to slightly declining. You have 3,757 students in the system in 2021. Over the last 10 years, that number had been as high as 3,935, 3,976. It's now down to 3,757. The 24 projected new students is roughly 0.6% of your current enrollment. If you spread the 24 kids among the grades that we said they would be heading to, it's probably 1 or 2 kids per grade level at most. In my opinion, and we do a lot of analysis like this with many other school districts, I do not believe that the project is going to place a financial burden on the Summit Public Schools.